The name echoed in the damp, cold air of the parish church. A single, polished stone dropped into a still, dark pool. Alastair. The Duke of Blackwood, standing at the back of the nave out of a sense of suffocating duty, felt the word pass through him, not as a sound, but as a vibration, a chilling resonance in the bone. He had attended this provincial christening on the Cornish coast as a political necessity, a gesture of goodwill to the tenants on this far-flung corner of his estate. He had been bored, his mind wandering over shipping ledgers and the endless gray sea outside the grimy lancet windows. But that name, his name, spoken aloud by the balding vicar, pulled him back with a vicious jerk. He lifted his head, his gaze sweeping over the humble gathering of fishermen and their wives. It settled on a woman standing before the font. Her back was to him, but there was something in the line of her shoulders, a familiar, heartbreaking grace beneath the coarse wool of her shawl. Her hands, holding the white-wrapped infant, were not the pale, slender hands he remembered. They were chapped and reddened, the hands of a worker. The vicar droned on. "Do name this child Alastair." The woman turned slightly to settle the baby, and for a fleeting second, her profile was visible. The world, for the Duke, tilted on its axis. The stone walls of the church seemed to rush inwards, the smell of wet wool and melting tallow candles suddenly overpowering. It was Eleanor, his wife, the wife he had cast out 3 years ago, the wife he had believed a liar, an adulteress, the wife who had vanished from the dower house he had banished her to, presumed by all to have fled to the continent with a phantom lover, and in her arms, a child, a boy, perhaps 2 years old, with a shock of dark hair. The vicar took the boy, and as he did, the child looked over the clergyman's shoulder, his gaze sweeping the small congregation with the unblinking curiosity of the very young. The boy's eyes met his. They were the Beaumont eyes, a startling sapphire blue that had been the pride and curse of his family for generations. They were the same eyes that stared back at Alastair from his own reflection every morning. In that moment, the carefully constructed edifice of his life, his anger, his certainty, his cold, hollow righteousness, crumbled to dust. The lie he had swallowed whole 3 years prior was revealed not by a confession or an investigation, but by the simple, irrefutable truth of a child's eyes. He was a father, and he had destroyed the mother. 3 years earlier, their London house had been a tomb, a magnificent, gilded tomb, but a tomb nonetheless. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and the funereal perfume of hothouse lilies that his sister, Beatrice, insisted upon. Silence was the master of the house, broken only by the solemn ticking of the grand clock in the hall, each tick a second of their marriage dying. Alastair, Duke of Blackwood, was a man who possessed everything and felt nothing. He moved through his life with a sense of weary obligation, his title a weight, his fortune a burden. His marriage to Eleanor had been a suitable match, a union of 2 respectable bloodlines. He had expected it to be a quiet, orderly partnership. He had not expected the profound emptiness that settled over him in her presence, an emptiness he mistook for her failure, not his own. Eleanor felt it too. She felt it as a physical pressure, a tightening in her chest. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, a creature of immense privilege, yet she felt like a ghost haunting her own life. The velvet curtains felt like shrouds. The Aubusson carpets muffled her footsteps until she felt she made no impression on the world at all. Her husband was a stranger, a polite, handsome, distant figure who shared her bed, but never her thoughts. He looked at her, but he did not see her. His sister, however, saw her all too clearly. Lady Beatrice moved through the house with a proprietary air, her silks rustling with an energy that seemed to suck the very oxygen from the rooms Eleanor entered. Beatrice's smiles were thin, her compliments barbed. "You are looking pale, dear Eleanor," she would say, her voice dripping with false concern. "This London season is so draining on a delicate constitution." The implication was always there, hanging in the air like smoke. Delicate, frail, barren. 2 years they had been married, and the nursery remained silent. Alistair, engrossed in his duties, seemed not to notice, but Beatrice ensured the failure was laid squarely at Eleanor's door. She would speak of other, more robust bloodlines, of her duty to the Beaumont name, all while patting Eleanor's hand with cold, reptilian fingers. Eleanor began to feel unwell, a persistent, rolling nausea that came upon her in the mornings, and a deep, bone-weary fatigue she could not shake. She attributed it to the oppressive atmosphere of the house, to the slow poison of Beatrice's presence. She kept it to herself, another secret in a house built of them. The shattering came on a Tuesday, a gray, drizzling afternoon that stained the windows and mirrored the color of Eleanor's world. Alistair had been in his study all day. Beatrice had been fluttering about, a vulture in lavender silk. She summoned Eleanor to the morning room, her face a mask of theatrical distress. Alistair was there, standing by the fireplace, his posture rigid. On the mantelpiece, next to a porcelain clock, lay a single sheet of stationery. "Alistair," Beatrice began, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "I came upon this. It seems it was dropped in the hall. I would not have believed it. I could not." He did not look at his sister. His eyes were fixed on Eleanor, and in them was a coldness she had never seen before, a glacial fury that froze the air in her lungs. "Is it true?" he asked. His voice was quiet, terrifyingly so. Eleanor looked from his face to the letter. She did not need to read it. She knew, with a sudden sickening certainty, that this was a trap, Beatrice's masterpiece. "I don't know what it is," she said, her own voice a thin whisper. "It is a letter," Alistair said, his words clipped and precise. "A letter from your lover, planning a rendezvous, detailing your contempt for me, for my name." The nausea that had been her constant companion for weeks surged, hot and acidic. "I have no lover. Do not lie to me." The quiet broke, and his voice cracked across the room like a whip. "Do not add lies to your betrayal." "It is I who have been betrayed," she said, looking past him to Beatrice, who now dabbed at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. At that moment, the family physician, Dr. Albright, was shown in, a man whose gambling debts were the talk of the lower staff. Beatrice had summoned him, she explained, because she had been so worried about Eleanor's erratic health. The doctor, his face grave, spoke of nervous afflictions, of feminine hysterics brought on by guilt and a weak moral character. He spoke of how such conditions could mimic the symptoms of a delicate state, but were, in fact, a sign of barrenness, a sickness of the mind manifesting in the body. It was a perfectly orchestrated assassination. Eleanor did not scream. She did not faint or weep. A profound and terrible calm settled over her. The room, the accusations, the triumphant smirk she caught on Beatrice's face, it all became very clear, very sharp. She saw the intricate machinery of the conspiracy, how Beatrice had whispered her poison into Alistair's ear for months, priming him for this moment, how he, in his emotional blindness, had believed every word. He had not even questioned it. He had wanted to believe it. It was easier to believe her a monster than to admit the failure of their marriage was his own, and in that moment of absolute annihilation, as her husband pronounced his judgment, she understood the truth of her own body, the nausea, the fatigue. It was not a nervous affliction. She was pregnant. She was carrying his son, and he was casting her out as a whore. His sentence was swift and cold. "You will be removed to Blackwood Manor. You will live there in seclusion. You will not be permitted visitors. You will not use my name. You are, from this moment, nothing to me." Blackwood Manor was a crumbling dower house on the bleakest edge of his northernmost estate, a prison. She knew Beatrice would not allow her even that small mercy. Her sister-in-law would find a way to torment her, to ensure her life was a living hell. She would find a way to deal with the child, should she ever discover its existence. That night, while the great house slept, Eleanor made her choice. It was not a choice born of weakness, but of a sudden, ferocious self-preservation. It was for the tiny, secret life inside her. She moved silently through the darkened rooms. She took a small reticule and filled it with the cash she had saved from her personal allowance. She packed a single bag with her plainest dress, a sturdy pair of boots, and a heavy cloak. She paused before her dressing table. The diamonds in her wedding ring caught the faint moonlight from the window, glittering like chips of ice. They felt alien on her finger, a brand. She twisted it off, the gold suddenly cold and heavy. She placed it on the polished mahogany surface, next to a string of pearls he had given her for their first anniversary. She left it all behind, the jewels, the clothes, the name. She walked out of the Duchess of Blackwood's bedroom and down the servants' staircase. She slipped out a side door into the damp London fog, a ghost leaving her own tomb. She was no one. She was Ellen, and she was free. The journey was a blur of exhaustion and fear. She took a public coach north, then west, trading coaches and routes, muddying her trail until she was sure no one could follow. She ended up in Cornwall, a place so remote, so disconnected from the world she had known, that it felt like another country. The sea air, sharp and clean with salt, was the first real breath she had taken in years. She found a room in a small, windswept fishing village clinging to the cliffs, a place of granite cottages and screaming gulls. She told the taciturn landlady her name was Ellen, that she was a widow. No one asked questions. In a place where life was a daily struggle against the sea, a person's past was their own business. Her life narrowed to the harsh realities of survival. The soft hands of the Duchess blistered and bled as she learned to mend fishing nets for a few pennies. Her back ached from scrubbing floors and washing laundry for the more prosperous village families. She learned to live with the constant gnawing of hunger, saving every spare coin for the baby. Section. She grew harder, thinner, her skin weathered by the sun and wind. The quiet, passive woman she had been was scoured away, leaving a core of resilient steel. Her entire world, her entire purpose, was the child growing within her. When her time came, it was Morwenna, the village midwife, who held her hand. A woman with a face as wrinkled as a dried apple and eyes that had seen everything. In a tiny, cold room with the sound of the ocean crashing against the rocks below, Eleanor gave birth to her son. He was perfect. He had a thatch of dark hair and a furious cry. When he opened his eyes, they were the impossible, brilliant blue of the Beaumonts. Looking at him, her heart cracked open with a love so fierce it was painful. This was her victory. This was her survival. Morwenna asked what she would name him. Eleanor looked at her son, this secret heir to a great dukedom, and a small, defiant smile touched her lips. "Alistair?" she said. Back in London, the Duke of Blackwood's life had become a monument to silence. The house was perfectly ordered, perfectly run by Beatrice, but it was dead. The removal of Eleanor had not brought him peace, only a vast, echoing emptiness. The victory his sister had orchestrated felt like ashes in his mouth. He found her wedding ring on the dressing table. He picked it up. It was still warm from her skin. The thought was unnerving. He closed his hand around it, the metal pressing into his palm. He had expected to feel righteous anger, vindication. Instead, he felt a profound, chilling sense of loss. Beatrice thrived in the vacuum Eleanor had left. She redecorated, hosted sober, political dinners, and managed his social calendar with ruthless efficiency. She was the perfect ducal sister, and her presence began to suffocate him. Her constant chatter, her knowing glances, her subtle manipulations. He started to see the web she spun, and it repulsed him. He retreated further into himself, into his work, becoming the cold, unfeeling duke everyone assumed him to be. 2 years passed. 2 years of hollow days and long, regret-filled nights. The seed of doubt was planted by a dying man. a former footman of Dr. Albright, consumed by a deathbed guilt, sent a rambling, barely literate letter to the Duke. He spoke of his master's terrible gambling debts and how they had miraculously vanished right after the Duchess's departure. He wrote of a late-night visit from a veiled lady in a fine carriage, a large sum of money exchanged. It was a small thing, a servant's gossip, but it landed on the fertile ground of Alistair's own gnawing uncertainty. For the first time, he allowed himself to question the narrative he had so readily accepted. He remembered Eleanor's face in that moment, not guilty but stunned, annihilated. He remembered her quiet dignity in the face of his rage. He hired a man named Fletcher, an investigator known for his discretion and his tenacity. He did not tell Beatrice. He told Fletcher to start with Dr. Albright and the forged letter. He wanted the truth, no matter how ugly. The investigation was slow, meticulous. Fletcher was a bloodhound. He uncovered Albright's ruinous debts. He found the forger, a man living in squalor in the Rookeries, who confessed to creating the letter for a handsome fee paid by a woman he identified as Lady Beatrice. He found servants Beatrice had dismissed, who spoke of her obsessive jealousy, of her overheard whispers and muttered threats against the Duchess. Piece by agonizing piece, the truth assembled itself. It was a portrait of a betrayal so profound, so monstrous, it left Alistair breathless. He had not been a wronged husband. He had been a fool, a cruel, blind, arrogant fool. He had been the weapon, and his sister had aimed him at the heart of the one person who had been utterly innocent. The question then became, where was Eleanor? The trail was 3 years old. Fletcher's men found traces of her flight. A coach ticket here, a brief stay at an inn there. But she had vanished. Alistair became obsessed. He poured his fortune and his focus into the search, driven by a desperate need for a redemption he knew he did not deserve. A year later, a whisper, a report from a local agent in Cornwall, about a reclusive widow named Ellen, living in a fishing village on Blackwood land, a woman who kept to herself, who worked with her hands, and who had a young son with startlingly blue eyes. Alistair traveled to Cornwall under the guise of inspecting his tenant farms. He arranged his visit to coincide with the village's Sunday service. He told himself it was to observe from a distance, to confirm without causing a scene. He entered the small, cold church, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. And then he heard his name. After the service, the small congregation spilled out into the churchyard, blinking in the weak sunlight. The air was scoured clean by the sea wind. Alistair watched as Ellen spoke quietly with the vicar, her son held tight in her arms. She looked older. The softness was gone from her face, replaced by a stark, beautiful strength. She was no longer the Duchess. She was someone else entirely, a woman forged in hardship. He waited until she was alone, walking down the narrow, cobbled path that led towards the cliffs. "Eleanor," he said. She froze, her back stiffening. For a long moment she did not turn. When she finally did, her face was a pale, hard mask. Her eyes, which he remembered as gentle and full of a quiet sorrow, were now cold and stormy as the winter sea. "That person is dead," she said, her voice low and rough, unused to the cadences of her former life. "My name is Ellen." "Please," he began, taking a step towards her. "We must talk." "There is nothing to talk about, Your Grace," she spat the title, making it an insult. "You said all that needed to be said 3 years ago. Now, if you will excuse me, my son is cold." She tried to move past him, but he blocked her path. He was desperate, the words tumbling out of him. "It was a lie, Eleanor. All of it. Beatrice. She forged the letter. She bribed the doctor. I have proof. I was a fool. I know that. A blind, arrogant fool." She looked at him, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. It was not relief or forgiveness. It was a profound, weary contempt. "A fool," she said with a bitter laugh. "Yes, you were. But you were a willing one. You never trusted me. You never loved me. You were looking for a reason to be rid of me, and she gave you one. Do not lay it all at her door. You hold the blame as well. You were the judge. You passed the sentence." Her words were stones, each one striking him with brutal accuracy. He had no defense against them because they were the truth. He looked from her face to the child in her arms, who was now watching him with wide, solemn blue eyes. His son. "He is my son," Alistair whispered, the reality of it still staggering. "No," she corrected him sharply, pulling the boy closer. "He is my son. I am the one who carried him, who bore him in a cold room with no one but a stranger to help. I am the one who worked until my hands bled to feed him. I kept him safe from you, from your family. You have no claim on him. You forfeited that right when you threw his mother away like she was nothing." The pain of her words was a physical thing, a blade twisting in his gut. He saw the chasm between them, a canyon carved by his cruelty and her suffering. It was too wide to be crossed with a simple apology. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice raw with a despair he had never known. "Tell me what I can do to fix this." She looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. "Leave," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Go back to your world, Your Grace. Leave us to ours. That is all you can do for us now." She walked away, her steps sure and steady on the uneven path. He watched her go, the wind whipping her coarse shawl around her, until she and his son disappeared into one of the small, granite cottages huddled against the cliffside. He was alone, with the sound of the gulls and the sea, and the wreckage of his life. He did not leave. To leave would be to accept the finality of her judgment. It would be to abandon his son, and the only woman who had ever mattered, a fact he now understood with devastating clarity. He sent his fine carriage, his valet, and his entourage back to London. He walked into the village's only inn, the Pilchard's Rest, a place that smelled of stale ale, fried fish, and damp wool, and took a room. The innkeeper, a stout man with a suspicious squint, looked him up and down. "A long stay, my lord?" "For as long as it takes," Alistair replied, the words feeling like a vow. The Duke of Blackwood, living in a cramped, musty room above a public house, became the subject of intense local speculation. He ignored the whispers, the stares. His world had shrunk to this small village, to the woman in the cottage on the cliff, and the boy with his eyes. He did not approach her again. He respected her demand for distance, understanding that his presence was a wound. Instead, he watched. He learned the rhythms of her life. He saw her rise before dawn to haul buckets of water from the communal well, her back straining with the effort. The next morning, a team of workmen arrived from the nearest town. By noon, a new iron pump stood in the well's place, making the work a fraction of what it had been. No one knew who had paid for it. He saw the leak in her cottage roof, the dark stain spreading on the thatch. A few days later, a roofer appeared while she was out, mending nets on the shore. He worked quickly, efficiently, repairing the damage and reinforcing the structure against the winter storms. When Eleanor returned, she found a neatly patched roof and a small, anonymous sack of coins left on her doorstep. Payment, the roofer had told a neighbor, from a concerned benefactor. He sent for Fletcher to bring the portfolio of evidence he had compiled against Beatrice, the signed confessions, the bank ledgers showing the payments, the sworn testimonies. He did not take it to Eleanor himself. He walked to Morwenna's cottage. The midwife greeted him with a wary expression. "I will not force her to see you, Your Grace," she said, her voice firm. "I am not asking you to," he said. He handed her the heavy leather portfolio. "This is the truth of what happened 3 years ago. It is proof of her innocence. I ask only that you give it to her. Let her read it in her own time. That is all." Morwenna studied his face, her shrewd eyes seeming to see straight through to the hollow ache in his soul. She took the portfolio. "I will give it to her." Days turned into weeks. He fell into a routine. He would walk the cliffs, the sea wind a constant, punishing force. He would sit in the inn, nursing a single ale, listening to the fishermen's talk, and he would watch for glimpses of his son. He saw him playing on the shore, chasing gulls, his laughter carried on the wind. It was a sound both beautiful and agonizing. Eleanor, after a week of ignoring the portfolio Morwenna had given her, finally opened it. She sat by her small fire, the papers spread on her lap, and she read. She read the forger's pathetic confession, the doctor's damning ledgers, the testimonies of servants detailing Beatrice's calculated cruelty. She read it all, and the cold, hard anger that had been her shield for 3 years began to crack. She had known she was innocent, but to see the proof, the sheer methodical evil of the plot against her, was staggering. It did not absolve Alistair. He was still the man who had believed the lies, but it reframed him. He was not the architect of her ruin, but its primary, most effective tool. She started to allow him small moments with the boy. At first it was supervised, from a distance. She would sit on a rock, mending a net, while Alistair, not the Duke, but a quiet, somber man in plain, durable clothes, showed little Ali how to find the best flat stones for skipping across the water. The boy, unburdened by the past, was naturally drawn to this tall, quiet man whose eyes were so like his own. He began to call him Stare. Alistair never pushed for more. He accepted every small concession with a quiet, humble gratitude that chipped away at her resolve. He was not the arrogant Duke she remembered. That man was gone, stripped away by guilt and regret. In his place was someone she did not know, someone who was patient and kind and deeply sad. Armed with the proof he needed, Alistair knew he had one final, brutal task to perform. He returned to London, a place he now loathed. He walked into his grand, silent house and summoned his sister to the study. Beatrice entered, her face alight with a triumphant smile, assuming he had returned to his senses. The smile froze when she saw the look on his face. It was not a shouting match. It was a cold, quiet execution. He laid the evidence on his desk, piece by piece. The confessions, the bank records. He watched the color drain from her face, her composure shattering like fine china. "You poisoned my mind," he said, his voice level, but filled with a loathing that was absolute. "You destroyed an innocent woman. You denied me my son. For what? For this house? For a place at the head of my table?" She tried to lie, to dissemble, but the proof was irrefutable. Her denials crumbled into pathetic pleas. He was unmoved. "You will be removed to the estate in the Orkneys. A generous allowance will be provided for you, but you will not leave. You will have no contact with society. You will never see me or my son again. If you defy me in this, I will turn this evidence over to the authorities and see you ruined publicly. Your name will be a curse." He did not wait for her reply. He walked out, leaving her amidst the wreckage of her ambition. He had her name legally cleared, issuing a public statement that the Duchess had been the victim of a cruel and elaborate deception, and that he was personally responsible for the grievous error. The scandal was immense, but he did not care. The only opinion that mattered was that of a woman in a cottage in Cornwall. He returned to the village, not as a duke, but as a petitioner. The breakthrough came on a stormy evening. The wind howled around the cottage, and the sea crashed against the cliffs with a furious roar. There was a knock at the door. Eleanor opened it to find Alistair, drenched and haggard. "The fishing boat from Penzance is overdue," he said, without preamble. "The men are forming a search party. I'm going with them." She saw in his eyes it was not a request for permission. It was a statement of fact. This was what men in this village did. They risked their lives for one another. "It's a fool's errand in this storm," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Perhaps," he answered. "But they are my people, my tenants. My responsibility." He looked at her, his gaze direct and filled with an old pain. "It's a responsibility I have failed at for too long." He turned and vanished into the driving rain. Eleanor spent the night pacing the small cottage, her son sleeping soundly in his cot. The fire dwindled to embers. Every gust of wind sounded like a death rattle. She was terrified, not just for the fisherman, but for him. She realized, with a jolt that shook her to her core, that the thought of a world without him in it was now unbearable. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind something more complicated, something fragile and tender. Just before dawn, they returned. They had found the boat. Its mast snapped, dashed against the rocks. They had pulled 3 men from the freezing water. 2 lived. 1 did not. Alistair was among the last to return, his face gray with exhaustion, his arm bleeding from a long gash where he'd been thrown against the rocks. He stumbled to her cottage. She opened the door before he could knock. She pulled him inside, out of the storm. Without a word, she pushed him into a chair by the fire, stoked the embers back to life, and went to fetch bandages and hot water. As she cleaned the wound on his arm, her touch gentle, their eyes met. The silence in the small room was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the storm outside. "Why did you do it?" she whispered. "Risk your life for them?" He looked at her, his sapphire eyes, so like their sun's, filled with a weary truth. "Because there is nothing left to do but the next right thing, Eleanor, and then the next. For as long as I have left, it is the only penance that matters." In that moment, she saw him. Not the Duke, not her betrayer, not the fool. She saw Alistair, a man broken by his own mistakes, trying, humbly and painfully, to piece himself back together. Her hand, calloused and strong, came up to cup his cheek. He flinched, as if expecting a blow, then leaned into her touch, his eyes closing. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his face. "My name," she said softly, "is Eleanor." It was not a surrender. It was a choice, a deliberate, conscious act of grace. Forgiveness, she realized, was not about wiping the slate clean. It was about accepting the scars and choosing to build something new on the broken ground. They did not return to London immediately. They stayed in Cornwall through the winter, living in the small cottage. Alistair taught his son his letters. Eleanor taught her husband how to mend a net, how to read the sky for a coming storm. They talked for hours, unspooling the years of pain and misunderstanding. They courted each other under the vast, star-filled sky, on the wild, windswept cliffs, falling in love not with the titles and expectations they had once worn, but with the people they had become. When they finally returned to the ducal estate, it was on their own terms. The oppressive London house was sold. They made their home in the country, at a sprawling manor filled with light and air. The heavy velvet curtains were torn down, the funereal lilies banished. The silence was replaced by the sound of a child's laughter, echoing through the halls. They were different. He was no longer the arrogant, detached Duke. He was a partner, a father, a man keenly aware of the weight of his responsibilities, not just to his title, but to his people. He poured his energy and fortune into improving the lives of his tenants, building schools and hospitals, remembering the harsh lessons he had learned in a small fishing village. She was no longer the timid duchess. She was strong, confident, her own woman. She worked alongside him, her counsel sought and respected. She never lost the steel she had forged in hardship, but it was now tempered with a deep and abiding love. Years later, on a warm summer afternoon, Eleanor stood on the lawn, watching Alistair and their son, now a boy of 10, by the edge of the lake. Alistair was showing him how to skip stones, his arm around his son's shoulders, his head bent close to his. They were laughing, the sound carrying across the water. The air smelled of cut grass and damp earth, of new blossoms and the promise of rain. It was a world away from the gilded cage where their story had begun. This was not a life they had inherited. It was a life they had built together, piece by painful, beautiful piece, on the foundations of a hard-won forgiveness. It was peace, it was real, and it was theirs.